People want me to react to the Lord of the Rings teaser trailer, so I guess we're going to do that now. The Rings of Power teaser trailer has divided the Lord of the Rings fandom even worse than the Wheel of Time fandom. The camps are divided roughly into let's watch and wait and this is woke garbage and insulting to the Lord of the Rings canon as well as Tolkien himself, with the latter banding together to produce takedown content in social media while being called racist by the let's watch and wait group and the traditional media. Does that accurately sum it up? To me, the biggest questions are these. 1, does The Rings of Power look like it could be a good TV show? And 2, is the Lord of the Rings fandom actually being toxic and racist? Unfortunately, I don't think you can really answer these questions without diving into racism, including whether the Lord of the Rings canon can be interpreted as racist and/or why it might appeal to racists even if it's not. That is especially relevant if you are calling the show woke. In case you weren't aware, this is not a new conversation. Tolkien's work has been accused of being both blatant and passively racist since the stories were first published. Racism also permeates the Lord of the Rings fandom in the same way that racism has permeated human history, especially British colonialism and American history. Even if you understand that Tolkien himself was not racist, and think your objections to this teaser trailer are just wanting a pure take on the lore, I promise you, it's more complicated. There is a context, and that is what we are here to talk about. So, why me? Plenty has been said about this subject already, so you might be wondering, what do I have to add to this conversation? I am not even an active participant of the Lord of the Rings fandom. It's been years since I read anything by Tolkien, and I had to spend quite a lot of time refreshing my knowledge just to make this video. I also was not really anticipating the TV show, and I have no investment in its success or failure. Or at least I didn't until I decided to do this. The reason I didn't really care about it was that I kind of assumed that a TV show based on the appendices of The Lord of the Rings was going to be a lot more like the filler content in the Hobbit movies than it was going to be like the works that were actually written by Tolkien. And since I didn't really like the Hobbit movies, I kind of assumed that I wouldn't like this either. In case you didn't know, The Rings of Power is not based on a story written by Tolkien. It takes place during the Second Age of Middle-earth. This is well after the Silmarillion and well before the Lord of the Rings. Amazon only has the rights to adapt what is described in the appendices of the Lord of the Rings. It doesn't have the rights to the Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, or any of the other works that are actually written by Tolkien. So this is going to be an original story written by a TV studio. What could possibly go wrong? And since the show is being produced by the same studio that produced the Wheel of Time TV series, I am interested in what they are going to do. I'm actually more interested in the political controversy around the teaser trailer than the trailer itself, at least for now. I also think it's important to note that I am not a Tolkien superfan. I am a normal fan. I have read The Lord of the Rings a few times. I have read the Silmarillion twice. I have read most of Unfinished Tales and some of the Lost Tales. And I did all of this before the Peter Jackson movies came out, but it was a long time ago. This makes me more familiar with Tolkien than people who have only seen the movies, but less familiar than Tolkien superfans or Tolkien scholars who continuously read and study and comment upon Tolkien's works. I do not, for example, speak Elvish, and I have only a patchy memory of Elvish history and family trees. I do think my perspective might be worthwhile for another reason, though. I am interested in this discussion because The Rings of Power is the newest installment in media and entertainment that is being lambasted for being woke, a term that I find to be disingenuous and steeped in far-right ideology, but which I do think is worthy of respectful discussion, especially with people who object to media on the basis that it strays from the canon lore and not for political reasons. I say respectful because I do not believe that the world is divided into good people and racists. I also do not believe that being a stickler for canon makes you a racist, even if the canon material could be described as racist, which I'm not saying Tolkien's is, but that criticism does exist, so we should cover it. However, I also do not think that entertainment can be divided into good and woke. There are a few other reasons why my perspective might add some worthwhile context. 1, I am a wide reader of the fantasy genre. 2, I have been both a conservative and a liberal politically. 3, I work in marketing and PR, and I used to be a social media analyst. That last one might require some explanation, as it is not a common job title. Around 10 years ago, I worked in a professional capacity as part of a team that analyzed internet conversations in order to inform organizations how their brands, products, or campaigns were performing in social media. With $1 billion on the line, I can assure you that Amazon is doing this kind of analysis right now. One way to direct public opinion is to publish articles that dismiss detractors as extremists who don't represent the majority. But judging by comments on the teaser trailer on YouTube, it's not exactly a minority complaining about this trailer. Is this true across all of social media or just YouTube? That's harder to say, especially as forum moderators are being aggressive in keeping the peace, and Twitter is hard to analyze. So, just what are fans upset about? Well, they are primarily upset that the Rings of Power looks like fan fiction set in Tolkien's world, and that the studio is taking some liberties with the source material, which might align to a political agenda. Although there are numerous small complaints, the biggest ones are Galadriel being shown as a warrior princess, dark-skinned actors playing elves and dwarves, and dwarven women not having beards in the same way as dwarven men. Let's watch the trailer together. So right off, we have a female voice belonging maybe to this person who I think is supposed to be a Harfoot, one of the 3 races of hobbits who inhabit Middle-earth and who are said to be friendly with the dwarves. This is Galadriel, and I do not hate this portrayal the way some people seem to. In the Silmarillion, Galadriel is described as the only woman of the Noldor to stand tall and valiant among the contending princes. Tall and valiant. When the elves fled Valinor, it was Galadriel who led them. She was one of the leaders. She is as tall as Celeborn, I think 6'3", and she is described in other texts as being Amazonian and competing in athletic competitions. Although I don't remember Galadriel carrying a sword or wearing armor specifically, it doesn't seem implausible to me that she might, especially as we don't get much of an account of her deeds beyond her studies with Melian. Now, that doesn't mean that this TV show is going to do a good job writing Galadriel, but objection to these images based on Galadriel having the capacity to be a military leader are simply incorrect. Okay, so here we have this shipwrecked character, and I think this is a human that Galadriel encounters named Halbrand, who was created for the series, although that might not be his real name. It could be revealed that he is the man who later becomes the Witch King, or he could become one of the other 9. This is a Sylvan elf named Arondir, also created for the series. I understand the criticism about casting a dark-skinned actor to play an elf, which I will get into in a bit, but just purely on the snippets we see in this teaser, this character interests me. I think that this is Gil-galad, more Galadriel, a dwarf. This is Elrond, which I like less. I don't like his haircut. I think he kind of looks like Steve Harrington from Stranger Things, and although it's not necessarily a bad look, it's just not what I think of when I think of Elrond. Another dwarf, this one female, and I think a princess. Okay, and here we have Galadriel's hair pushed aside to show her ears. This is very fast, but I like this moment being in the trailer because it does hint at racial tensions that should exist in this world. Although, I should note that there really isn't much attention put on ears in Tolkien's writings. It's also a little concerning that someone would do that to Galadriel. It's a little invasive and it makes her seem vulnerable, which I'm not sure that I like. And then we get this Meteor Man, which is probably an Istari, one of the wizards. We might see all of them fall to Middle-earth this way since they are supposed to be sent by the gods as messengers. And then a bunch of stuff happens really quickly and the teaser is over. If I had to take a shot in the dark about what the plot of this show's first season is going to be, I would guess that it will show us Galadriel coming to terms with a personal loss, struggling on her own at first, but then encountering others, most likely Halbrand, who will surprise her or change her in some way that leads her to taking up a leadership position in the alliance of men and elves. I think through Arondir, we will learn about tensions between elves and humans, or possibly between elves and dwarves, as we see him being shot at, chained, and then escaping. I think we may also get introduced to Sauron presenting a fair face and using seductive words to the destruction of many. The Valar will then send the Istari to help, and that small hand gripping a larger hand towards the end will symbolize the bonds that form between members of different races and the hope that those bonds bring in a darkening time. Now, obviously, these are just wild guesses, and the devil is in the details. I have no reason to think that this story is going to be good at this point. I also have no reason to think that it will be bad. I think it's actually impossible for this story not to feel like fan fiction, though, because it is not an adaptation. It is an original story based on information in an appendix. So the writers are going to have to make up a story, and they can make up whatever they want as long as information is not contradicted. What I'd like to spend more time on is the different ways that fans have reacted to this trailer and how I view the fandom's reaction. First, I think it's important to note that there are 4 ways people to react to pretty much any type of art and entertainment. 1, they react as a fan, pure enjoyment. Do I like this? Why do I like it? Will I recommend it to other people? Second, as a critic, this goes beyond enjoyment and gets into how accurate is this? How closely does it convey the canon of the lore? How literary is it? How well executed from a technical point of view? Third is personal. This is about how a work of art or fiction affects you as a human being with a perspective and experience of the world. This can include things like representation, but can also just be what you got out of it, good or bad, even if that's not what the author intended. And last is society. What impact does this creative work make, or what conversations does it evoke, if anything? Okay, let's start with my reaction as a fan. Whether or not you like this trailer as a fan is really subjective. I can't tell if I will like the Rings of Power or not, because I don't know enough about the actual story, the dialogue, and the themes, which is what matters to me and what matters to most people as viewers. Visually, it looks good. There are landscapes that look sweeping, set designs that look expensive, the costumes are interesting, although I have seen criticisms of them, and the actors pique my interest. Also, there's a hint of tension, so it could be good, but it might also feel underbaked or overdone, the logic might be off, and I think the dialogue in particular is going to be really difficult to get right. I worry that the tone of The Lord of the Rings is just hard to pull off, and not every writer can do it. Next, let's talk about it as a critic. As a critic, I do see things in this trailer that are not in keeping with the lore of the Lord of the Rings canon. And displaying the deviations to that lore does seem really intentional. The first voice and characters we see are female. There is both a dwarf and an elf with dark skin. The way this information is presented to the viewer does feel like that was the intention of the teaser, that the whole point was to proclaim that the Rings of Power is going to be a different kind of TV show than the movies were when they came out 20 years ago. The Rings of Power is going to be more inclusive and more diverse than the canonical body of works to date. And I don't really think that I have to elaborate on why this was done. I think the show has come out and said that it has taken creative license to reflect modern day diversity and be more inclusive of a modern day audience. What I do want to cover is why fans have reacted so poorly to this. I'm going to start with an aside. The appearance of the beards on the female dwarves doesn't matter to me. I just can't summon up any real feelings about this change, so I'm not going to spend much time talking about it. If anything, changing the way female dwarves look might just be a missed opportunity to demonstrate a non-binary culture where men and women are almost indistinguishable. But I do rather like Galadriel's portrayal from what we can see in this teaser. Galadriel doesn't get that much attention in the Silmarillion, and we don't know what she spent her time doing during the Second Age. I will be annoyed if the show portrays her as young and brash, because Galadriel is supposed to be one of the oldest and wisest elves alive in Middle-earth, and Sauron himself feared her. But she could be conceivably angry or frustrated. I will also be really annoyed if they try to do some kind of a romance plotline with Galadriel, because she's supposed to be married to Celeborn, and elves are very fatalist about marriage, so I hope that doesn't come up. But the armor and the sword, those don't bother me. Now let's move on to casting darker-skinned actors as elves and dwarves. Oh boy. I think we need to talk about how racism influences this controversy, but I do want to acknowledge that the main concern that has been expressed by fans is that this decision to cast actors of color is disrespectful to Tolkien's work because he created his entire mythology to represent the language, culture, and folk stories of Old England before the Norman conquest. This is Anglo-Saxon England of yore, which spoke Old English and Middle English, and which had its own racial and cultural tensions, which you could argue are represented by the different races and peoples of Middle-earth. Adding characters of color into this dynamic might make the world of Earth feel a bit muddier. It could also make it feel less immersive, less of an escape, less Celtic, and less like a real place lost in time. It would also have less in continuity with the books and the movies, which could impede enjoyment for people who really like those installments. The reasons to do this also seems flimsy to these critics. The films were incredibly successful, despite having an almost entirely white cast. People of all races, ethnicities, and nationalities are able to escape into this world and relate to these characters, so why change the formula? In addition, skin tone is a very surface level way to represent someone, and some people feel like it's tokenistic in the Rings of Power. The general feeling among conservatives especially is that the Rings of Power will be yet another installment in woke media, plundering identity politics for a cash grab. From their perspective, it's not a sincere attempt to deepen the art. The traditional media, of course, does not portray the criticism in this way. Instead, headlines appear in newspapers and magazines that the Lord of the Rings fandom is sexist and racist and toxic. But you have to acknowledge that some of them are. Of course they are. Middle-earth has been attractive for racists since it was first published. The question is how much racists represent the fandom today, and that might depend on how you define racism. And this is difficult to talk about, but I'm gonna give it a try. Personally, I look at racism as a spectrum, not a binary. On one end, you have white supremacists whose vision of the world involves stack ranking people in an inflexible manner based on birth, appearance, and the desire to dominate other cultures rather than mix with them. On the other end of the spectrum, or maybe in the middle, depending on your model, are people who are passively perpetuating racial stereotypes and norms, sometimes without realizing they are doing so. People who are oppressed by racist systems can feel invisible, unrecognized for who they are, while racism is invisible to people who aren't directly affected by it. This makes it hard to talk about. Now, you probably think that I'm going to tell you that if you object to elves having dark skin, that means you are racist, just not a very strong racist. But I'm not going to say that. Insisting that elves should be fair-skinned is in keeping with the canon of the lore. It's a purist view of Tolkien's work that not everyone will agree is important, but it's not racist. At least, not if your objection is based on respecting the inspiration for the elves. It should be noted that Middle-earth is not actually England, and that mythologies are not actual histories, but they are based on a real place and time. Elves are also a real cultural belief that people in this area of the world have, and especially have had historically. Although the etymology could be contested, and I am probably going to make a lot of mispronunciations here, the Middle English word elf comes from the Old English eilf, from Proto-West Germanic albi, from Proto-Germanic albits, which probably derives from the Proto-Indo-European albus, meaning white. So, if you care about language, which Tolkien certainly did, elves are white. In Tolkien's mythology, elves are more often described as fair, meaning beautiful but also pale, which is the standard for beauty in this culture, different cultures having different standards of beauty. There are many examples of this in the books, although it should be noted that fair-faced can also refer to friendly, or at least appearing friendly. I should note that there are also high elves and dark elves, but dark elves don't refer to skin tone. High elves are those who came to Middle-earth from Valinor, remember the Valar, and beheld the light of the trees. They are sometimes described as radiating or reflecting light. Dark elves, by contrast, refused the summons of the Valar and never dwelt in Valinor. And although different cultures having different standards for beauty is widely accepted, Tolkien has been criticized for aligning this cultural standard of beauty to morality, in the sense that fair folk are pitted against the dark races. There are even criticisms that the orcs represent other races, despite orcs being described as corrupted elves in some texts, and that word also having come from an ancient Old English term meaning monster or giant. Fortunately, there are also many exceptions to this attempt to force the story into an allegory. These exceptions make it pretty clear, at least to me, that a commentary on modern-day race relations, whether from 1930 or the present, was not Tolkien's intention. Critics of Tolkien have also pointed out that the races of Middle-earth have a hierarchy, and white supremacists love a hierarchy, so they have latched onto this aspect of the mythology as denoting a racist fantasy. Tolkien himself, though, was not a white supremacist, no matter how much some people seem to want to label him as one. He did much of his writing during the rise of Hitler, who he openly despised, and he also despised the Nazi race doctrine, which he called wholly pernicious and unscientific. He was also born in South Africa during apartheid, and he is on record about how much he loathed that system. He was a proud Englishman, but he loved England, not Britain, was actually kind of hostile to British colonialism and imperialism. I think you can also make the case that the shade of skin tone is not the most important aspect of elves and is not something Tolkien spent a great deal of time describing any more than he did elven ears. Nor is it overly important to the themes of Tolkien's stories. Tolkien is much more interested in the pride, valor, and wisdom of the elves and their relationship with the trees and the stars, with each other and the other races of Middle-earth, as well as their gods. In my opinion, the racial hierarchy in Middle-earth is much more influenced by Tolkien's religion, Catholicism, than it is his politics, especially in the portrayal of his more ethereal beings, which are kind of similar to the way angels are ranked. The whole story of the elves is basically about how they came to know evil, defied their gods in pride and anger, were sundered into groups and became wearied of the world after fighting endless wars against an evil that they could not defeat. They gain wisdom in rejecting the temptations of power and vengeance and coming to understand the importance of humility. It's also important to note the central role that hobbits played in the story, as well as the overarching theme of fellowship between the races, which could be viewed as a polycultural reordering by the end of the series. So, where does this leave me from the perspective of a critic? Well, for me, the presence of dark-skinned actors doesn't ruin stories set in Middle-earth, especially works that are not actually written by Tolkien. It might throw some questions and it could interfere with the logic of the world depending on what these writers do with it, but then again, we are also talking about a flat world that later becomes a globe. So I don't know how much logic and scientific accuracy actually matters here. With the Rings of Power, the writing really is the biggest question. Who in the world has the writing chops to compete with Tolkien? We already have a prequel story to The Lord of the Rings with a lot of original content written by screenwriters. It's the Hobbit movie trilogy, and it's just not very good. It has some glimmers of greatness, like I really like the Misty Mountain Cold song, but it should have been one movie with a lighter, funnier tone than Lord of the Rings. It should have cut the weaker content from the book, not added to it, and especially it should not have added more characters and a silly romance plotline to a story that already had too many characters and definitely wasn't about love. The Hobbit was extended to make money, though, so they had to come up with something to fill the space. And there's no reason to believe at this point that the Rings of Power has better intentions. I hope they do, but we'll have to see. So the third way to react to entertainment is through a personal lens. And it's too early to say based on a teaser trailer, but this one does have the potential to drive me nuts. I mean that it can be annoying when people talk about what some book or song or painting means to them personally when they aren't able to articulate what it means generally or what the author meant by it or what is true about it in context. People have a tendency to put their personal feelings and beliefs and experiences before facts, and that can get pretty tired. And this isn't restricted to one side of the political spectrum. I see this from all kinds of people. This is an opportunity to talk about an important aspect of critical thinking, though. You should be able to evaluate art both in terms of what it means to you and what it meant to the person who created it and the context in which it was created. You should be able to hold more than one idea in your mind at the same time about the same thing. You should be able to separate your feelings from what someone else believes, as well as what the truth is. That's how learning works. I have written many papers explaining that I understood material I may not have agreed with. Please do not confuse these two concepts. So, personally, I like seeing more of a focus on women in Middle-earth, but I also acknowledge that Middle-earth, as Tolkien wrote it, was largely a patriarchal society with few exceptions, Galadriel being one of them. Again, I don't know yet if I will like how Galadriel is portrayed in the Rings of Power, but I don't object to the choice to make her a central character. We'll just have to see how they do it. I personally do not identify as Anglo-Saxon, and I definitely don't look to Tolkien's mythology to affirm some notion of English purism, racial hierarchy, or white supremacy. So adding people of color to the cast of a TV show about Middle-earth, even if it's supposed to be set in Anglo-Saxon England, doesn't threaten me with existential dread. But we do have to acknowledge that the term Anglo-Saxon has been conflated to mean white. For example, this term is used to describe the acronym WASPs, which stands for White, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant, but really just means well-to-do white Christians living on the east coast of the United States who may or may not be descended from the British. This conflation of the term Anglo-Saxon and white goes back to the 18th and 19th century when Anglo-Saxonism was used in both the USA and Britain to endorse white supremacy and British imperialism. It is undeniably part of America's founding identity. Of course, that has an impact on how Tolkien's works are understood or misunderstood, especially by people from Britain or who live in America. However, it should be noted that white is not an ethnicity. White is not a culture. White is not a nation. White does not have a unifying language, religion, or mode of dress formed by a native land. White really only has meaning in contrast to black and brown, in defense of a racial hierarchy that evolved from and was used to justify British imperialism and colonialism. Actual ethnicities that count as white have changed over time in order to ensure a majority hold, at least in America. And I feel like I shouldn't have to explain this, but the very notion of race among humans is a social construct. Although differences in physical attributes and culture are organic, notions of race and racism were designed with the intention of being able to stack rank people by looking at them or knowing their ancestry or where they come from. In practice, this results in a system that can be used to exploit people for economic gain and deny them advancement in order to maintain an advantage for a certain group. That is the essence of systemic racism in a nutshell, and it permeates human history dating back to at least 15th century Europe. And this brings us to the impact on society, the last way to critique art and entertainment. I know this is getting a little heavy, but please try to bear with me. This one is concerning because there has already been a societal impact made by the Rings of Power. At least it certainly seems to have furthered the political divide between Americans on the left and right based on growing tensions about wokeness and what people interpret that to mean and who to dismiss based on that interpretation. I'm sure this is happening in Europe too, but I really only see what's going on in America, so if you're in Europe, I know that your political separations are a little bit different. Please put in the comments below how you're seeing this play out where you live. The question I have is whether this impact is intentional and just whose agenda is actually playing out. First, we have to look at the criticism of woke media in its historical context. Get woke, go broke is a slogan that references how social justice warrior activism is ruining media and entertainment. The phrase is said to have originated with John Ringo, a best-selling author of science fiction, military, and political thrillers, who wrote about these concepts in relation to the Sad Puppies controversy. The Sad Puppy controversy is when the Hugo Awards for science fiction were rigged by conservative authors based on a feeling that stories with progressive themes had been unfairly dominating the awards for years. The essay written by John Ringo was originally on Facebook, but it has since been taken down. It was also later popularized by Milo Yiannopoulos on his website dangerous, which also has been taken down. I don't have much to say about John Ringo as a person or a writer. He has a Twitter account, so you can go see what he posts about, and I hear he sometimes appears as a commentator on Fox News, but I don't know him, and I have not read his books. I also have trouble finding evidence on how this whole thing began because so much of it has been removed from the internet, which might give you an indication of how genuine and well-researched these notions are. And what are the notions? Well, the crux of the argument, based on what I can find, is that Hollywood is dominated by liberals and social justice warriors who do not care about good storytelling, and that when faced with the choice between creating a good story or furthering a social justice agenda, they will choose to further a social justice agenda as if it is always a choice, good or woke. Ringo further makes the claim that butchering popular franchises is done on purpose to stick it to white straight men and the beloved works of fiction that mythologize their greatness. Modern examples of woke media include the Disney Star Wars trilogy, the 2016 Ghostbusters remake, Doctor Who since its first female doctor appeared, the Star Trek Picard series, and Marvel's recent installments. Now we have Tolkien. The go broke part of this equation is the assertion that brands that prioritize social justice over good storytelling, particularly themes of putting straight white men in their place, risk their own destruction. White men make up the majority of viewers for the science fiction and fantasy viewership, and they will object and stop watching, which will cause the company to lose money and go bankrupt. This will force studios to reckon with the damage and start making pure films and TV shows that resonate with fans. Proof that this is actually happening, that movies with social justice warrior themes are causing movies to bomb, can be found all over conservative media. And only conservative media. The problem I have with this argument is that it's disingenuous. It is just as political, if not more political, than what it espouses to despise. The people behind this slogan object to feminism, multiculturalism, and normalizing LGBTQ. They tell fans that it is the progressive concepts alone that are ruining movies and television all of a sudden. Go woke, go broke is a concept that they want to make true, not a concept that is true. It is a political campaign. This is why there has been a surge of content around this concept, particularly on Reddit and YouTube, where influencers are calling for fans to grab their pitchforks and object to diversity in science fiction. Now here's the thing. I have observed that some of the installments made to popular franchises are bad. Most people watching this channel know that I don't care for the interpretation of the Wheel of Time, and especially the decision to muddle the lore in order to avoid talking about gender while downplaying male characters. I also did not like The Last Jedi. However, although I have not seen all of the shows and movies being lambasted as woke, most of them do not deserve to be criticized because of their progressive themes or the casting of the actors, and some of them aren't even bad. I will need a whole video series on woke movies and TV shows to explain why. My overall point is that objecting to an adaptation because it makes changes from the source material that you love is not necessarily sexist or racist or pandering to the far right. However, these reactions are also not the same. 1. A show portrays straight white men as being collectively and inherently bad and irredeemable. Reaction: critique it and stop watching. 2. A show features women, or people of color, or LGBTQ characters. Reaction: assume it is an affront to straight white men and campaign to harass everyone involved with it. One of these is not like the other. What is interesting to me is that it's only very recently that I have seen shows and movies that actually might be going for number one. Like where the creators are intentionally, maybe, producing stories that purposely attack straight white men as a group. What I see happening is an escalation over wokeness. People are getting frustrated, and there may be some dummies out there who have been triggered into actually doing on purpose what they have only been accused of doing up until this point. This is oversimplified, but it plays out something like this. Activists or researchers identify a problem in society and issue a call to action, like feature more women and people of color in popular science fiction. Studios respond with diversity and inclusion. Conservative-leaning fans object that this is insulting to the canon of work, or the genre, or the traditions that they're used to. Now, some are actually responding to bad writing, but overall what is heard is that the fans don't want women and people of color in their territory, or they only want to see them in non-threatening or traditional ways. For example, women must be either sex objects or warm and nurturing. This reaction alarms activists. There are collective gasps that racism and sexism can be so entrenched, even invisible to the people espousing such views, despite the long history that they should be well familiar with because they've actively studied it, was the whole point of their activism. Articles are then written explaining that the detractors are just racist and sexist. They still seem to be watching these shows, and they'll either have to get over it or be dismissed for their toxicity. Conservatives then cherry-pick the worst reactions to their reactions and respond with outrage, sometimes fake outrage. They engage in takedown campaigns, the most radical activists, or the most vulnerable, or the public faces that are easiest to find, such as the actors playing the characters they dislike. They will do this while denying that they are being racist or sexist or political. The left then responds in defense of the people and media being attacked. And now you have mobs on mobs engaged in a digital culture war for the soul of nerd fandom. And yes, it does happen that some people develop a taste for group-backed vigilante justice. Sometimes we do eat our own, canceling anyone who says anything objectionable. Attention can also push people into embracing victimhood, and even persuade them to manufacture social injuries to rage about. Mob behavior happens on both sides, though. And it doesn't always happen in this order. Either side can start it, but like in a real war, there is an aggressor attempting to take over turf that they think belongs to them or should belong to them. Those occupying that space put up a fight. Both sides will point to the other as the aggressor or claim that they are just defending their territory. So you have to ask yourself, who does a fandom belong to? The purists or everyone who enjoys it? We should also look at how we got here. There are people who think our political divide is worse today because of this controversy, that social justice warriors are at fault for wanting stories to be more representative and respectful of people enjoying them today. They think characters are actually less well written now, that movies and TV shows are less original now than they were in the 80s. But this is an insane thing to think. Stories aren't worse now. They weren't better in the past. Science fiction and fantasy has always leaned progressive, and the standards for progressive have always shifted over time. Moreover, we are living in a golden age of entertainment, and that's especially true for science fiction and fantasy. There is so much more content to choose from now than there used to be, and overall, it is much better than when I was growing up. To me, this notion that TV, movies, and books used to be better is just an echo of America was great at some time in the past, like before civil rights. In my opinion, original storytelling is not the problem. The problem is social media, or at least that's one of the things that I think is the problem. We consume media all day long, and we consume it differently than we used to. We are predisposed to perspectives we already have rather than challenged to learn something new. Algorithms are designed to serve us content that engages us, not content that educates us. That means we are being driven to consume what makes us emotional, because emotion is engaging and it's easy to become addicted to those feelings, which in turn makes us irrational and drives people to insanity. And I'm not saying traditional media is better, but traditional media was struggling before the internet. We don't pay for news, so journalists have to compete for views and clicks to survive, and that means sensationalized headlines and political theater that sparks emotion, the most effective of which is outrage, and it has to do that 24 hours a day. And that's not even touching on the laws that were passed that changed the news from what it used to be to what it is now. Social media is actually worse than traditional media, though, because there is no barrier to entry. There are no publishing standards. There are no editors. Anyone can publish anything and reach millions with no accountability or fact-checking required. And people are much, much more susceptible to messaging than they think they are. The effectiveness of barraging people with strongly stated opinions is very well known. That is why Russia has been flooding our social media with messaging for decades to try and undermine faith in democracy and improve sentiment toward Russia. And now we are seeing the reason why. And of course, white supremacists have also made gains in society and in our public discourse through social media. All they have to do is speak strongly, and they definitely have strong opinions. They also can completely ignore facts, which is just fine in social media because there's no one fact-checking. Again, I am not talking about YouTubers who are just purists of whatever original content they favor. When it comes to Lord of the Rings, there are a lot of people who just want future installments to resemble the Peter Jackson films. I have seen quite a bit of good content from people like this. I am talking about the people trying to influence fans that the problem with the world is the liberal agenda without being honest that they have a conservative agenda. And the truth is that the woke media controversy was begun by people who have said blatantly misogynistic and racist things. You could argue that conservatives are rejecting democracy altogether at this point. They have seen that when everyone votes and the game is not rigged, conservatives will be voted out. That was the issue with Sad Puppies in the Hugo Awards. Now it is a fight at all levels of government and society. The objective is really to sow doubt in any agenda that equalizes people. Because what supremacists want, and perhaps what they think is natural, is a stack rank system with them on top. Feminism, multiculturalism, socialized medicine, and overall democracy is antithetical to traditional hierarchies that advantage some people over others. But, of course, they will try to sell you an argument that it's postmodernism or liberalism or affirmative action or Marxism or whatever that's trying to undermine a merit-based system where they just happen to be the most deserving. This is seductive because people want simple answers and clear enemies. They are vulnerable to messaging that there is such a thing as a proper order inherent in the world, that life is not messy, that it's not random. It's comforting to think this way. It's why religion is so effective as a means of governing people and bringing them together, and why critical thinking and personal accountability is so hard to instill. But if you do come to see that the world is disordered, you become the real definition of woke. You will see that injustices do exist. Not always intentionally, but they are there. And worse, if you experience it, it is very hard to live with and pretend like you didn't see it. If you are aware of what is at stake, you want to wake other people up to what is going on. And it is distressing to see people actively hitting the snooze button or fighting with you over whether or not a thing exists. So of course people fight for social justice. Of course they fight for inclusiveness in the stories we tell about the world. We all want fairness. Injustice inspires conservatives as much as it inspires liberals. I understand that. People want to be fairly treated. They want their work to be fairly considered. They want to be respected. They want to be treated with kindness and compassion and be given the benefit of the doubt that their intentions are good and not evil. But if we don't talk to each other about what is actually going on, this divide is only going to get worse for everyone. Here is a simplistic way of how it works. Let's assume that this side wants to change the world in some way, and this side wants the world to remain the same. I think a fair question is, what do you want to change the world to? What does that future look like? And more specifically, what does the future you want look like for me? And an unreasonable answer, which I see come from both the political left and the political right, is we don't care about you. A better answer would be, let's work on that together. If it's not clear, I believe that it is important to be charitable to the people around you, the people you share the world with, and that you have to work with to get things done. I think it is wise to look to the past, but also to have a vision of the future so that you know where to set your feet. And this applies to writing stories as much as it applies to the real world, especially fantasy and science fiction stories, which are often concerned with speculating about a version of the world that doesn't currently exist, often with an underlying message about what could be. When it comes to the Rings of Power TV show, I don't know what to expect. I can't tell if it will present a good vision or a bad vision. I don't know if it will be good or bad. I can't tell because I don't watch a trailer that shows women and people of color and think, this is gonna be bad. That being said, I did feel burned by the Wheel of Time, and the Rings of Power is being made by the same studio. It might be poorly written. It might go further in butchering the lore. There might be a message that I will find appalling. But even if it's actually really, really good, I expect we will see a lot more "it's bad because it's woke" arguments. Tolkien's work is a perfect battleground for white supremacists, and they are going to speak out, and what they say might sound fair, but it might feel foul. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe. I am relatively new to YouTube. When I do videos like this, it takes a lot out of me. Let me know if you like this longer, sort of more dramatic take on important issues, or if you prefer something more off the cuff with a raw reaction, because those are easier for me, but definitely feel a little bit less polished. So let me know in the comments below. Please like and subscribe, and until next time. Where are you going?